describe 2023's Dark Harvest? Boy, this is going to take some explaining. This is directed by David Slade, who did the adaptation of 30 Days of Night. And here he is adapting a 2006 book called Dark Harvest into a film. And how to describe this in kind of a little log line? I would say this is a mix of Dark Knight and the Scarecrow meets The Purge meets The Hunger Games. Yes, sounds like a bizarre mix. I will try and give you the best synopsis I can without kind of spoiling anything for you. So this takes place in the early 1960s, and in this particular kind of small town America, there seems to be some type of curse where every year on Halloween, this kind of being is kind of resurrected called Sawtooth Jack. And he's effectively a kind of a jack-o'-lantern kind of style boogeyman. And his aim is to essentially bring ruin to the town. And he must be stopped by midnight on every year. And they do this by essentially challenging teenagers of a certain age to try and defeat this kind of like entity. And the winner, if they succeed, effectively gets prize money, and their families are kind of looked after and things like this. And so we have this kind of like gang mentality where all these kind of youths are, most of them are kind of vying for a position to kind of win the prize. Some are kind of like afraid to do it, and effectively it's the kind of like the the lower end of the kind of the class spectrum that are kind of forced to do this. In preparation, these kind of teenage boys are kind of starved and effectively set out in as kind of like masked mini gangs to try and stop this kind of Sawtooth Jack character. In the meantime, they seem to be causing havoc among the general kind of populace as well. So what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. The movie follows a particular character called Richie, whose brother actually won the contest the previous year. So he's actually exempt from having to participate, although he kind of wants to do so because of, effectively he kind of feels like he's living under the shadow of his older brother. And he has his own kind of little gang, all of whom wear kind of Misfits masks from the band Misfits in their kind of big night out. And, they have their attempts to try and defeat Sawtooth Jack. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. It's a little bit of a bizarre setup, I have to say, and I don't think the movie does a particularly kind of good job of bringing you along for the ride. And I have to say, it probably would behoove you to at least, get a little bit of a synopsis before watching this so you can understand it. But let's talk about what I think works in this movie. Now, David Slade, of course, as I've mentioned, directed the 30 Days of Night, which I actually really enjoyed as a kind of a vampire movie, and it was very visually kind of striking, as is this movie. It feels like a lower budget, to be honest, but it still is visually very striking with some really kind of fantastic kind of atmospheric kind of sequences, in the cornfields with bits of corn, maize kind of flying around in the air and stuff like that against the kind of like the October kind of moonlight and stuff. It looks fantastic. I mean, I have to say, there's some very, very kind of like iconic kind of shots in this kind of sequence, in these movies. So I really like the look of it. I like the cinematography. And there's some visually striking imagery on display here outside of that as well. All these kind of youths, in their kind of 50s kind of get-up, all kind of in their little individual kind of gangs that have a kind of a themed mask, will remind you of, like the Warriors, for example, or the Outsiders. And, we have violence upon other kind of like, it's just townsfolk, because these kids are kind of all starving and stuff. They act more like animals. The actual kind of visuals of the Sawtooth Jack character, I think, are pretty good as well. A kind of jack-o'-lantern kind of style kind of entity. Looks pretty freaky. And it has moments of real brutality in it as well. There is some wonderfully kind of gory kind of sequences as Sawtooth Jack cuts a swathe through these kind of like mass of you know, young men who are basically trying to kind of stop him. And the movie actually has a larger mythology as well. It's kind of like has this kind of this curse which we learn more about as the kind of the film kind of progresses. It's all kind of like set in this kind of 1960s backdrop. So we have this, you know, these kind of the styles of the time, including kind of the music as well, attitudes towards the time and stuff. So it's a very kind of like interesting film to kind of watch. It kind of reminds me of a Stephen King story in kind of some ways. It has definitely a Stephen King element, and as I say, it was actually an adaptation of a pre-existing novel from 2006. There seems to be a lot of characters in this movie, you know, so you're not quite sure who you're meant to be following to a certain degree and who's going to be a major character and who isn't. We spend a reasonable amount of time with kind of a lot of the kind of the supporting characters, and ultimately some are less important than you think they might be, but there you go. But yeah, it's certainly a very unique feel to it. As I said, it really did remind me of Hunger Games and kind of The Purge with this kind of like this pumpkin aesthetic. It really does have that vibe. It kind of makes it somewhat of a kind of a unique story in some ways. And you know, in 2023, it's, you know, there seems to be lots of kind of like sequels and kind of reboots and stuff. So it's nice to see a really kind of somewhat original story, albeit it's one that's adapted from a book. But nonetheless, it kind of feels like it stands on its own 2 feet in a lot of ways, and it does have a nice production value, and I think the cast do a kind of a good job. In some odd roles, I mean, it's a little bit off kilter, this movie, it has to be said. The characters are a little strange, and it kind of feels like this is like an alternate Earth in some ways, but I can't really fault the kind of the acting here, to be honest. There's some kind of, you know, good performances, and I feel the movie has a kind of nihilistic kind of view in some ways of the way these kind of characters are portrayed. What doesn't work for me, the movie is a little just a confused narrative, to be honest. I deliberately tried to go into the synopsis there in reasonable detail because I actually feel it would help, because the movie, I don't think, particularly establishes what's going on very well. And you know, I think of this as someone who, if I were to sort of recommend this to someone else and said, and they went in cold without kind of reading anything and thinking, what's this? I could just imagine people thinking, I don't know what's going on. The movie is, you know, is trying to kind of not reveal its kind of all its cards. It's fairly obvious that there may be more going on here, but nonetheless, I think it's a little bit kind of like narratively sparse in regards to kind of you know, what the actual kind of setup is, and what the kind of how the characters are kind of like interacting with each other and stuff like that. It all feels a little bit kind of like half-baked in some ways. I've kind of attended to it. We were introduced to a lot of characters, this kind of gang that our main character Richie is part of, but ultimately we were introduced to a lot of characters that really don't really go anywhere, if I'm honest. I mean, they kind of feel more like kind of red shirts, to be honest. You know, once you've watched their film as a whole, and I think characters that could have done a little bit more, with a little bit more kind of fleshing out, like the father, Richie's father, for example, a couple of other characters, some of the kind of like the elder kind of townsfolk, this guild that we often hear about, could have been a little bit more kind of fleshed out as well. Now, apparently there have been some changes to the book. I've not read the book, so I can't really kind of say what was changed and what wasn't, but it just feels like some bits were kind of focused on like a lot of peripheral characters like these boys, and some weren't, and also it kind of feels a little inconsistent in how some of these characters are being treated. And you know, we're meant to believe that they are they starved for 3 days beforehand, and I didn't really see the point of that, to be honest. Surely you're going to make these kids weaker, if anything. It's meant to be this, so they're ferocious and stuff, but surely if they're starved for 3 days, they'd be weaker going against this kind of this particular kind of entity seems like an odd choice. So there's some kind of like things here that I just feel are a little ill-explained. And, you know, I think it's trying to kind of like have this kind of reveal that happens. And I think it's fairly obvious what the kind of the reveal is, to be honest. Even though I think the movie is kind of vague with the setup, it's still kind of obviously, okay, there's definitely going to be some type of gotcha moment. And it's like, yeah, it's kind of, that's what I thought it might be. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's still an enjoyable film, and because it's such a kind of like original film in some ways, certainly compared to other films, I will have to give it props for that. And visually speaking, it's quite good. It's just that I think the narrative could have been a lot stronger. I think the characterization could have been better, or with some characters, it's, you know, essentially, and even our main character as well. Could have been a little bit more sympathetic to a certain degree with his parents and stuff. So visually speaking, it's exciting, it's fun, it's gory, it's kind of somewhat kind of an interesting idea, but there's some elements around it that I felt were narratively a little weak, to be honest with you. But overall, I have to say I still enjoyed this movie. It's a recommend for me. I would say I would give it a 7 out of 10 because I do think, just because it's such a very different story, it's worth a watch like that, but it is flawed. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.